You climbed nearly every one of these ranks yourself, over almost 2 decades inside one single company. Every company has an invisible ladder, and almost nobody explains the actual rules for climbing it. This is every rank you will pass through, from the first nervous day to the corner office. Some ranks take years, some take months, and one of them nearly ends the entire climb. You noticed early which employees explained things patiently, and which ones brushed off basic questions entirely. You made a mental note to be the patient kind eventually, if the chance to lead anyone ever came. At the bottom, you are an intern, unpaid or barely paid, fetching coffee and taking notes nobody reads. You show up early, leave late, and volunteer for tasks nobody else wants to touch. A senior employee barely learns your name, calling you by the wrong one twice that summer. You correct him gently once, and let it go the second time without much reaction at all. The internship pays almost nothing, but the access to real meetings pays in a different currency entirely. By the final week, 3 people finally know your name, and one of them writes you a reference. A coworker at the next desk became your first real work friend, someone to complain to quietly. You both compared notes on which managers gave clear feedback, and which ones just seemed permanently annoyed. A late-night deadline forced the whole junior team to stay past 9, ordering food and pushing through together. The shared exhaustion built something like camaraderie, a first real taste of what teamwork actually felt like. Looking back later, that second-month mistake became the story you told most often to junior hires yourself. 6 months later, a junior analyst role opens up, and your internship reference gets you the interview. The starting salary barely covers rent, but the title finally sounds like an actual career beginning. Your desk sits in a row of a dozen identical desks, junior analysts spread across the entire floor. You learn the systems fast, asking more questions than most, absorbing everything the senior staff mentions. A mistake in your second month costs the team a minor delay, small but noticeable to everyone involved. Your manager corrects you calmly, without much drama, treating the mistake as simply part of learning. You never make that particular mistake again, and the manager notices the improvement within weeks. You took on a mentee of your own for the first time, a junior analyst fresh out of college. Teaching someone else the systems made you realize how much you had actually absorbed over 2 years. Your mentee from that period eventually became a senior analyst herself, following almost the exact same path. She thanked you at her own promotion, saying your early patience had shaped how she approached mentoring in turn. 2 years in, a senior analyst position opens, and you apply alongside 3 other junior colleagues. The interview panel asks harder questions this time, testing judgment rather than just raw technical knowledge. You get the promotion, along with a modest raise and a desk slightly closer to the windows. 2 junior analysts who did not get promoted treat you slightly differently for the first few weeks. You handle it the same way you handle most tension, quietly, without making the moment bigger than it is. Within a month, the tension fades, and the same colleagues start asking you for advice again. Years later, the rival sent a brief message congratulating you on the executive promotion, genuinely, without bitterness. You replied warmly, and meant every word, glad the old competition had faded into simple mutual respect. A fellow senior analyst competed openly for the same team lead position you eventually won. He campaigned loudly for weeks, mentioning his own achievements in nearly every conversation available to him. You said little about your own record, the same quiet approach you had carried since the internship. When the decision came down in your favor, he took it professionally, mostly asking what he had missed. You told him honestly that consistency had mattered more than any single loud moment in the process. He left the company within the year, landing a team lead role somewhere else entirely on his own merit. You attended that same conference 3 more times over the following years, each time slightly more senior than before. By the 4th visit, younger attendees approached you the same nervous way you had once approached senior staff. The company sent you to an industry conference the year after your promotion to senior analyst. You attended sessions quietly, took detailed notes, and networked far less aggressively than most attendees around you. One connection you made there, almost accidentally, became a valuable industry contact for years afterward. You brought back 3 concrete ideas from the conference, all of which your manager eventually implemented. The trip cost the company relatively little, and returned value far beyond what anyone had initially expected. The senior director who tested your theory that day later became one of your strongest professional allies. Years later, she still occasionally reminded people in meetings about the calm way you had handled that crisis. 18 months into the senior role, the company's biggest client threatened to leave over a major error. The error traced back to a system nobody had touched in over a year, buried deep in old code. Panic spread through the department fast, senior leadership demanding answers within the same afternoon. You had worked adjacent to that exact system months earlier and remembered a detail nobody else recalled. You spoke up in the crisis meeting, calmly, pointing toward the exact place the error had originated. A senior director tested your theory immediately, and within an hour, the theory proved completely correct. The client stayed, the crisis passed, and your name reached rooms it had never reached before that day. You did not ask for credit publicly, but the credit found its way to you anyway, quietly and completely. A different analyst on your team consistently outperformed everyone, quietly, without needing much guidance at all. You made sure her work got proper visibility upward, something her previous team lead had never bothered doing. The struggling analyst you mentored eventually thanked you at his own promotion celebration years later. He said publicly that your patience that first quarter had changed the entire trajectory of his career. Leading that first team taught you the exact difference between managing tasks and actually developing people. It was a distinction you carried into every rank that followed, quietly shaping how you led for years afterward. The crisis accelerated what might have taken years, and within 6 months, a team lead position opened. You now managed 4 analysts, people who used to sit at desks identical to your old one. Leading felt different than doing. You had to trust other people's work instead of controlling every detail. One analyst struggled visibly that first quarter, missing details you would have caught instantly yourself. You mentored him patiently instead of reassigning the work, remembering your own early mistakes clearly. By the end of the quarter, he had become one of the most reliable people on the entire team. Watching him improve felt more satisfying than any of your own individual achievements had ever felt. A budget dispute between 2 of your teams required careful mediation, neither side fully wrong or right. You found a compromise that satisfied both teams reasonably, a skill nobody had explicitly taught you before. An employee affected by the layoff decision reached out over a year later, unexpectedly, just to say thank you. She explained the transition support you had insisted on had made a real difference during a difficult stretch. 3 years after the crisis, a full management role opened, overseeing multiple teams across the department. The role meant budgets, hiring decisions, and considerably more distance from the daily technical work itself. You missed the technical work sometimes, the satisfaction of solving a problem with your own hands directly. The trade-off came with real influence, shaping how entire teams operated instead of just one small piece. A difficult layoff decision landed on your desk that year, the hardest part of the role by far. You handled it as fairly and transparently as the situation allowed, though it never felt fully comfortable. The decision cost you sleep for a week, a weight none of your earlier promotions had ever carried. A major strategic pivot fell on your desk that year, deciding which of 2 product lines to prioritize. You gathered data from every team involved before deciding, a habit carried over from your analyst years. The parking lot view stayed with you longer than expected, a small daily reminder of exactly where you would start it. You never mentioned the significance of that view to anyone, keeping it as a quiet private motivator instead. 2 years into management, a director position opened above you, overseeing the entire division's strategy. The interview process took months this time, multiple rounds, a level of scrutiny you had not faced before. You got the role, along with a corner office considerably larger than you had ever occupied before. The view from the window overlooked the same parking lot where you used to park as an intern. You thought about that intern sometimes, nervous, unpaid, fetching coffee, having no idea where this would lead. The company had changed considerably since then, and so, in quieter ways, had you along with it. A younger employee asked you once, nervously, for advice on climbing the same ladder you had climbed. You told her honestly that no single rank had mattered as much as staying consistent through all of them. One acquired employee, initially the most resistant to the merger, eventually became one of your most loyal team members. She told you once that your patience during those early integration conversations had changed her mind completely. The acquired company's original founder reached out years later, curious how the integrated teams had ultimately fared. You told him honestly that the merger had strengthened both sides more than either company had originally expected. 2 years into the manager role, the company acquired a smaller competitor, merging two very different cultures. You were assigned to integrate 3 teams from the acquired company into your existing department structure. Some employees from the acquired side resented the merger openly, uncertain about their futures at the company. You spent weeks in individual conversations, listening more than directing, before proposing any actual changes. The integration succeeded more smoothly than leadership had expected, credited partly to your patient approach. A senior executive noticed the outcome, mentioning your name in a leadership meeting you were not even in. She sent one final email a year into retirement, simply checking in, curious how the succession planning was going. You wrote back a long reply, something you rarely did, telling her exactly how much that early correction had mattered. You adopted her habit of writing short, specific feedback notes, a small tradition passed down without much ceremony. The manager who had corrected your first real mistake years earlier announced her retirement that spring. She asked you, specifically, to take over several of her most important ongoing responsibilities personally. At her farewell gathering, she told a story about your second month, the mistake, and the quiet correction. Nobody in the room had heard that particular story before, and several colleagues looked at you differently afterward. You thanked her privately afterward, for the correction all those years ago, and for everything that followed it. She left the company a month later, and you inherited a piece of her responsibilities along with her trust. The board sent a formal welcome letter, framed later by an assistant and hung quietly in a corner of the office. 5 years after making director, an executive vice president role opened at the top of the division. The board interviewed you personally this time, a room full of people who controlled the entire company's direction. You got the role, becoming one of the youngest executives the company had ever promoted to that level. The salary now included stock options worth more than your first 5 years of combined earnings. You still remembered the exact desk you would sat at as a junior analyst, near the far wall by the printer. The distance between that desk and this office measured more than just years, though years had mattered plenty. Team members mentioned afterward that your calm demeanor during the overnight scramble had kept everyone else steady too. You had not felt calm internally. You had simply learned years earlier to keep the panic from showing outwardly. Leadership offered a bonus for the recovery effort, and you split most of it quietly among the 4 team leads. As manager, you oversaw your first major product launch, coordinating 4 separate teams under real deadline pressure. A critical vendor missed a deadline 2 weeks before launch, threatening to derail the entire coordinated schedule. You renegotiated the internal timeline overnight, redistributing tasks across teams without missing the final launch date. The launch succeeded on schedule, and leadership specifically credited the recovery plan you had built overnight. You felt the exhaustion more than the celebration, though you let yourself enjoy the moment briefly anyway. The sharper candidate later admitted she had almost withdrawn her application, assuming the polished candidate would win easily. You told her you were glad she had not, and meant it as more than just a polite thing to say. That hire eventually became a director herself, crediting the early chance as the turning point of her entire career. A hiring decision as director tested your judgment in a way analysis alone had never quite required before. 2 finalists remained, one impressively credentialed, one less polished but clearly sharper in the actual interviews. You chose the sharper candidate over the more credentialed one, against some quiet pushback from another director. The hire turned out to be one of the strongest additions the department had made in several years. The other director mentioned, months later, that your read on people had turned out sharper than his own. You noticed over the years that the tough board members' questions had actually made your presentation stronger. Preparing for her scrutiny specifically had become an unspoken part of how you approached every major presentation. Years into the executive role, that same board member became one of your strongest advocates during difficult votes. As director, you presented quarterly results to the board for the first time, considerably higher stakes than before. You rehearsed for days, anticipating every possible question the board might raise about the numbers. One board member challenged a projection sharply, testing whether you actually understood the underlying assumptions. You answered precisely, walking through the exact methodology without hesitation or defensive posturing. The board member nodded, satisfied, and the meeting moved forward without further serious challenge. Walking out afterward, a colleague mentioned that board member rarely let anyone off that easily before. Years later, you sometimes wondered about that other path, briefly, before returning fully to the one you had chosen. A competing company reached out directly during your time as director, offering a considerably larger role. The offer included a bigger title, more money, and a level of visibility you had never actively sought. You took the meeting out of genuine curiosity, asking more questions than the recruiter had prepared for. In the end, you declined, preferring to keep building at the company where your entire climb had happened. Your current company never learned about the offer, and you never felt the need to use it as leverage. Some decisions, you had learned long ago, were easier to make without turning them into public negotiations. The employee who had corrected you during the town hall received a quiet note of thanks from you afterward. She mentioned later that the gesture meant more to her than the correction itself had cost her in nerves. As executive, you made a rare public misstep, misquoting a figure during an all-company town hall meeting. The mistake was minor, but visible, corrected within the same meeting once someone flagged the discrepancy. You thanked the employee immediately, corrected the number on the spot, and moved forward without defensiveness. Several employees mentioned afterward how refreshing it was to see an executive handle a mistake that plainly. You had learned that lesson decades earlier, as a junior analyst correcting your own second-month error. You kept a printed copy of the article in a drawer, rarely looked at, but never quite thrown away either. Some recognitions, you had decided, were worth keeping quietly rather than displaying prominently on a wall. An industry publication named you to a list of notable young executives, based on the acquisition integration years earlier. The recognition surprised you. You had never sought visibility, and had mostly forgotten how visible the work had been. A journalist requested an interview, and you agreed reluctantly, keeping your answers short and fairly modest throughout. The published piece described you as quietly effective, a phrase that felt more accurate than anything grander might have. Colleagues congratulated you for days, and you deflected most of it back toward the teams who had done the actual work. Your mother asked separately, later that evening, whether you were actually happy or simply successful at this point. You told her honestly you were both most days, which seemed to satisfy her more than any longer answer would have. Your parents attended a company event once, during the director years, curious about the career they barely understood. They watched you navigate a room full of executives with an ease that surprised them both quietly. Your father mentioned afterward that he barely recognized the confident version of you standing in that room. You told him you still felt like the nervous intern most days, just better at hiding it now. He laughed, said that sounded about right, and the conversation moved on to something else entirely. You requested, quietly, that the renovation preserve a small plaque near that old desk area for sentimental reasons. Facilities obliged without asking too many questions, and the plaque remained long after the renovation finished. Years after leaving the analyst floor, you walked past your old desk area during a building renovation tour. New analysts sat where you once sat, nervous, focused, absorbing everything the same way you once had. One of them recognized you from a company newsletter, and approached nervously to introduce herself directly. You spent 10 minutes with her, more time than your schedule technically allowed, answering her questions honestly. Walking away, you recognized something of your own earlier self in the careful way she had approached you. You thought, watching the competitor's decline unfold, about how differently things might have gone had you accepted their offer. You felt no satisfaction in their struggles, only a quiet gratitude for the decision you had made years earlier. The competitor who had once tried to poach you struggled badly a few years later, several rounds of layoffs following. Word spread that some of their strongest people were quietly looking for new positions across the industry. You reached out personally to 2 former contacts from that company, offering honest conversations, not empty promises. Both eventually joined your division, bringing sharp skills and a clear appreciation for how they would been approached. Your former rival, the one who once campaigned loudly for the team lead role, was not among them. You heard through mutual contacts that he had landed somewhere reasonably stable, and felt genuinely glad to hear it. Watching him grow into the role felt like closing a loop that had opened years earlier with your own mentor. The company, you realized, ran on exactly this kind of quiet chain, one patient person developing the next. As executive, leadership asked you to identify and develop your own eventual successor within the division. You thought immediately of the analyst you had mentored years earlier, now a senior manager in his own right. You began quietly grooming him for larger responsibilities, the same patient way you had once been developed yourself. He asked once, directly, why you had chosen to invest so much time in his specific development over others. You told him honestly that someone had once done the same for you, and it had simply become how you led. A junior employee thanked you years later for the job security during that stretch, unaware of the deliberate trade-offs involved. You told her simply that protecting the team had always felt like the only reasonable option available. The downturn eventually passed, and the division emerged smaller in budget but fully intact in people and morale. A sudden market downturn hit the industry hard during your 4th year as executive, budgets tightening everywhere. You had to cut costs across your division without gutting the teams that had taken years to build properly. You protected headcount wherever possible, cutting discretionary spending and delaying projects instead of people first. The approach cost the division some short-term efficiency, but preserved nearly every position through the entire downturn. A board member later praised the decision specifically, noting how few divisions had protected their people that well. The old photo eventually found its way onto your executive office wall, the only personal item you ever displayed. Visitors occasionally asked about it, and you told the short version of the story, leaving most of it unsaid. The company held a small event marking your 15th year, an unusually long tenure by industry standards. Colleagues from every era spoke briefly, the old manager now retired, the once struggling analyst now a director himself. Someone found an old company directory photo from your first week, nervous, younger, barely recognizable at a glance. The room laughed warmly at the old photo, and you laughed along, genuinely amused by how far the distance felt. 15 years, a dozen ranks, and the same quiet approach that had carried you through nearly all of them. The intern downstairs had no idea yet how far the smallest, most unpaid rank could eventually lead. Every rank starts the same way, small, uncertain, and completely unaware of how far it might eventually lead. Looking back across every rank, no single moment had made the entire climb. Not really, not alone. The crisis had accelerated things, certainly, but the years of quiet consistency had built the actual foundation. You thought about the analyst you had mentored, promoted twice himself since that difficult first quarter. You thought about the manager who had corrected your first real mistake, retired now, still occasionally emailing. Every rank had required something slightly different: patience, precision, judgment, and eventually, real responsibility. Tomorrow would bring another set of decisions, bigger than the ones from years earlier, but familiar in shape. And somewhere below, in that same building, a new intern was probably fetching coffee right now, nervous and unaware.